This is a production of Cornell University.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking about a project I did with a whole team. I have with me today Dr. Maria Kennedy from Rutgers University, and she'll introduce herself in a minute. In the back of the room is Andrew James, one of our undergrad researchers. You can raise your hand, Andrew. And in front here is Victoria Broughton, who's also one of our undergrad researchers on this project. Not with us today, maybe online, I'm not sure, is Scott Ramsey. He's the executive director of the New York Cider Association, and he was also a partner on this grant. And we're going to show some of his handiwork and his part of the project in a few minutes. The project was funded by an engaged Cornell grant that we got from the Einhorn Center. So thanks to them, and also for they run a lot of different grant programs. If you're faculty and want to work with students and you want to work with community members, look into their various grant programs. Lots of interesting things, and allows you to do kind of projects that might be a little bit off the beaten path, if you will, but really a lot of fun as well. Okay. So the project, I got to stand a little bit further from this now. Very loud. The project we worked on is called the Foraged Fruit Project. And so the idea was that we were going to work with our community members, which would be our cider producers, to learn about this very interesting practice where they were going out into woods, abandoned orchards, old farmsteads, collecting apples, turning it into cider, and then actually selling that. So they were making an actual viable commerce commodity out of these foraged apples. Yeah, so I already did part one, the project introduction. There's just some really nice pictures of some of the various parts of the project. We have one publication that Maria authored that is in publication now, and then we're working on a second one, trying to wrap up all of the data that we collected that we're going to be sharing with you today. Okay, so I think one of the things that's really going to introduce this project is this video that we made. This was produced by Scott Ramsey, again, the executive director of the Cider Association.
So we wanted to get a better understanding of what foraging meant to the producers themselves. Why is it important for them to go out and find fruit in the forested areas or in their backyards, anywhere but a commercial orchard, which would be the easiest thing to do. And how can that tell us something about the kinds of things that are meaningful to people in this community?
It's super interesting, right? Because what is it about these apples that is unique, that's different than what they can buy from a commercial producer? So is it just that they're free? Is it that there's an adventure and a story that they can tell and it helps them to market their product? Or are there really specific chemical attributes to these fruit that they're not getting from their other sources?
We started with this little row of trees that we're standing in front of, and over time we would go, usually in the spring, and pick out some other tree and rescue it. Usually the first year is just kind of getting the vines out, cutting the brush out from under it, cutting out the dead wood, and then letting it go for a year, and coming back the next year and maybe doing a little pruning and trying to get a little bit of structure to it. Everything we do is spontaneously fermented. You're getting the yeast from the soil where apples have been breaking down for over 100 years here. And I just always feel like you get a little more character out of these old apples, out of foraged apples, than I do out of commercially cultivated apples. You're not going into it with a lot of control. You can exercise control later, but at the time that you're picking what's given to you.
Foraging for plants and fruits and herbs and materials like in the wild is something that was sort of always part of my life, including when I started the business and continuing to this day. And one of the ways that I learn a lot about growing cider apples is by also observing what's happening in uncultivated spaces and just taking cues from it and thinking about how I can incorporate what I see into my management practices in the orchard.
This orchard right here is primarily composed of trees that were grafted from wild seedling trees that I found around here that had properties that I thought would be really good for cider making. I mean, for years we were just planting English and French varieties that we know taste good for cider, but they're not necessarily that well adapted to our region. And so if we can find apples that work as well as those apples for cider, or better, and they're adapted to our local conditions, they might be the next generation cider apples, especially in very low input orchards like this that are organic, and the trees kind of have to fend for themselves a lot more than in a more agriculturally intensive situation.
So on the report cards, we included data that we took in the lab from the fruit itself. So like apple size and skin color. And then we also had tasting notes and aroma notes. And then we also included data from leaf samples that were sent to Washington State to learn more about the genetic lineage of the tree itself. And we had images on the report card to show off the flesh and the skin color and seed size.
My higher goal is to make apple orcharding more sustainable than it is. We're already, and as we would suspect, seeing distinct differences between this site in the wild forest, apple forest, and in the managed apple orchard across the creek. And it really talks about the importance of having very local or regionally adapted varieties to help push things along more sustainably. But we're seeing that change by younger people getting into it in a way where it's not so cost prohibitive. And I think that speaks to the value-added nature of cider. I think it's the unique genetics of a lot of the lost varieties that we're refinding in this rewilded landscape. And they're not buying into the industrialized commentary of how you should be raising apples.
So foraging to me is, the practice of going out, sort of connecting with the wild, with nature, with your local terroir, being able to sort of, locate apple trees around the area and then evaluate them and see if there's any desirable qualities for cider. I think it's really cool sort of movement that's happening here because you're able to better represent like the land that you're in, as well as the history of those apples. They have really unique qualities to them.
So the question is it commercially viable? Is it commercially viable to go into the woods and drag this fruit out in backpacks and canvas sacks in pickup trucks down old logging roads? And the answer is we don't really know. We actually, from our first round of genetic tests, it came back that only one out of the first 20 that we looked at was actually a known variety. Every other one was a new seedling. And so that's exciting. That's something different and new that I had not expected out of this research.
I like acid, I like flavor. I'm always chasing flavor. I mean, that's the end goal is flavor, and it can be flavor from the fruit, it can be flavor from the fermentation, it can be flavor from the aging.
But if it weren't for foraging, I wouldn't have made cider for 10 years and developed this lifestyle of not just making barrels of cider for myself, but introducing people to cider. And so I enjoyed not just drinking it, but sharing it with people.
Making cider is an art, and part of what we're learning and what foragers themselves are learning through this process is how to think more critically about what our landscape is, what its history is, how it's been used, and what our responsibility to it in the future is. And I think that ethos is what sort of starts the whole process that we're looking at in looking at the commercial application of foraging in the cider industry, and the way that those different ways of thinking about making a living creates a zone of a lot of inspiration and innovation.
I think the most surprising thing to me was learning that you could take an apple that is as harsh and unpalatable as a cider apple and turn it into something so delicious.
To go out here, even learn more about this land and how there's potential for these apples and how it's a really cool growing movement in New York for these foraged apples.
One of the things that's really meaningful to me about cider, like broadly, is that the care and attention that generations and generations and generations and cultures of people, of humans, of my ancestors have put into tending to this really specific relationship with the natural world, their relationship with apples and cider, and what we now have as a result of that, which is, you know, varieties that were selected from the wild and then named and then made and passed on. And I like sort of treasure that lineage and that legacy, and I see myself as getting this opportunity to participate in it and also to carry it forward.
It makes me feel part of the landscape that I'm living in, that I'm interacting with it, yeah, as part of it.
Jordy, who's in the white shirt here. His cider is the one on the left in the back there. It's called Spring Peeper, and that's made from foraged apples from nearby here up in Trumansburg near Iredell Road. So very close by. The other two ciders are also all made from foraged apples. So all three of those, and I'll highlight the producers as we go through the rest of the presentation today. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Maria now. And so Maria is by training a folklorist, and she did ethnographic studies on this project and interviewed our producers. And she's going to tell us a little bit about what we learned from that part of the project.
Yeah, so hello. I am a folklorist. We are out there in the wild. We're real intellectual beings. And I am in the American Studies Department at Rutgers University. As a folklorist, I'm really interested in vernacular practices. So everyday practices, things that are handed down from generation to generation, but also new vernacular practices that emerge. And one of the things about foraging is obviously this is a practice that's been with the human species for many, many generations. It's applied to many, many different kinds of plants and other materials out in the wild. And especially here in New York State, foraging is a vernacular practice that perhaps you yourself participated in the fall. You went out and found some apples, you brought them home. And I found, even before we started this project, that there were a lot of people doing this as a vernacular practice. So what was really interesting to see is how this became a commercial practice. And that's kind of what we were wanting to explore. And I'm just going to whiz through a couple of media and print narratives that can kind of give you a sense of how this emerged as a commercial practice in the last decade or so. The first time I came across this was with cider maker Andy Brennan. Back in 2013, he was giving tastings in New York City, and New York City foodie hipsters were going wild over the fact that he was making wild cider out of all of these foraged fruits. And so this is a Grub Street that's a sort of food publication talking about, you know, Brennan gets his apples mostly from foraging trips. So he was kind of one of the vanguard of getting this out there into the public as a commercial product, and people were really excited about it. There's a few other publications I'm just going to highlight really quickly. This is a sort of self-published, the Wild Apple Forager's Guide. The first Andy Brennan article is 2013. This was 2016, and this is mainly circulated amongst people who are engaged in this practice. So it's kind of an inside publication, but it kind of not only gives practical tips, but also a philosophy of why people are doing this. We apple foragers exist as the naturalist, the orchardist, and as our inner animal selves simultaneously. So really getting that part of the landscape ethos. Andy Brennan, again, he publishes a book about his own philosophy and practice in 2019. In 2020, in Malice, which is a zine that circulates within the cider industry, there was a really impactful article by Melissa Madden, who's here in the Finger Lakes, looking at the history. It's a brief and potentially erroneous history of the Finger Lakes National Forest Apple Commons, and she's really thinking about the history of the land, its uses, and people who have inhabited it, including indigenous peoples, over centuries.
And then some more recent ones in 2022 and 2023, these are, NPR and New York Times are starting to see this, right? Thinking about cider makers are seeking out wild apples, So this was really in the zeitgeist, in the media. And that's why we were like, well, we should take a look at what's actually going on. So I'm going to show you some of the main sort of social discourses that we found that were motivating people. And then I'm going to talk about how we sort of synthesized a selection process from what we saw that people were doing. So first of all, I wanted to highlight that we found people were really engaging in this, in sort of these recreation, entrepreneurship, and looking for cider fruit spaces. So up here, this is Dave Snyder from Left Bank Cidery. They really started their whole business and foraging practice because they were hiking in the Catskills and they were finding these trees while they were hiking. And this recreation thing is really not only the beginning of some people's practice, but also, they start their business and it's really catering to other people who are doing the same kind of thing, who are interested in the same kind of activities. Steve Penning's is a more established, Penning Cidery and Orchards is very established U-pick orchard nursery business down in the Hudson Valley. And he found this tree in his hedgerow. So he's got a commercial orchard, but he found this big old tree in the hedgerow and started playing with it, started making cider from it to add something more interesting to his established tourism and fruit cider enterprise. So both of these people, they were looking for cider fruit. They were looking for something that's going to give them more kinds of qualities to add to the cider that they were wanting to make. Another theme was landscape and rural restoration. Both of these folks had bought properties that had apples on them, and they didn't really know much about the nature of those apples. Were they abandoned orchards? Were they wild seedlings? But they were interested in trying to understand the history of their land and what they could do with it in the future. Violetta is a landscape architect. She really wanted to make this an accessible landscape for people to enjoy, to come and experience the beauty of upstate New York. But she was also interested in making cider from this stuff. So there's a lot of integrated motivations in how people start this process. We also found a lot of critiques of farm systems and social life. So you saw Mike Biltonen in the video. He has a lot of thoughts about critiquing knowledge economies and institutions and how this acts as a sort of incubator outside of our academic institutions for citizen science. And he really wants to emphasize how we can support that and build bridges across those two kinds of intellectual practices. Melissa Madden, who I mentioned earlier, she really got to thinking about how engaging with these landscapes can help us engage with issues of land access, indigenous rights, histories that are unknown and unshared. And so thinking about going into the wild as sort of a journey into the past, but also a journey into the present and the future of what we can imagine different kinds of social relationships. And then finally, genetic diversity and plant resilience were a big one that we found that people are excited about. And this comes not so much in the use of the fruit that you get when you go to forage immediately. It's like, oh, we found this fruit. It seems to be really good. It seems to be the tree is resilient. We want to perpetuate it. We want to graft it and propagate it. And so we have a couple of really interesting people just like really looking for these diversities of genetics and plant resilience. I'll come back to some of these later. After talking to all these folks, I wanted to synthesize what are they actually doing? How are they making these choices, these selection choices in their process? And I came up with these 6 principles of selection for cider: fruit appearance, fruit chemistry, fruit sensory perception, site accessibility, tree health, and integrated use dynamics. And I'll talk very briefly about each of these. The first is appearance. And this is really the thing that can bring people to the tree, right? They see a red fruit, they're like, oh, I want to go see if that's any good. And that might not, in the end, be a reason to keep using the fruit, but it brings them to the fruit in the first place. Also blossom, because people will go out looking for fruit in the spring. They're not going to find fruit, but they're going to find the trees blossoming, and that can help identify locations that might be useful. Fruit chemistry was a really big part of our project. People are looking for fruit
that is going to bring extra tannins, acids, and sugars. And I'll let Greg talk more about that. But that was a primary motivational factor for how they're going to choose which fruit to use. Separate from that, I've sort of broken out fruit sensory perception as tastes and aromas. So if you've got your fruit chemistry covered, people will then be like, ooh, this one of them really did taste like pecans. So they're looking for that extra added taste and aroma factor that can really make an apple stand out as something they want to go back to, propagate, and perhaps develop. Site accessibility, this is a logistical issue. How are people actually getting to this fruit? Because as Greg alluded to, are we going to go out and bring this back in backpacks? Or, you know, Autumn shared an early life memory, my earliest memories of like being pulled over on the side of the road, right? You can pull up to the side of the road and get it if it's in a neighbor's backyard, right? So some of these issues are really logistical in nature rather than having to do with the tree or the fruit itself. Disease and climate resistance. So Connor Hardiman, who's a nurseryman up in the North Country, he and his folks have been looking for cold hardy fruit for a long time, even before cider sort of became part of what they were thinking about. But a lot of people are out there looking for trees that have survived cold, survived disease, and that survival is indicative, perhaps, that this tree might have something not only to yield to the cider making itself, but to its capacity to develop and propagate a new variety that might be useful. And then the last one I have, I'm calling integrated use dynamics, which is a little bit of a clunky phrase, but it's trying to get at the fact this is another logistical issue. I have this quote from Chris, again, I don't want to be picking up drops in late August, right? How is their harvesting of this fruit fitting into other kinds of harvest practices? Some folks like Steve Doherty, whose cider we have today, you know, he told me, like, I started looking at individual trees, and then individual trees, you know, they were sort of meh, but if I just harvest the whole orchard, I'm getting a lot of different flavors. And so rather than thinking about one tree, he was thinking about the whole integrated properties of harvesting one block of orchard or wild orchard. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Greg.
Great, thanks, Maria. Okay, so the next part of it, I'll talk a little bit about the fruit chemistry measurements that we did in my lab. And one of the outcomes from this project, one of the deliverables was what we call report cards. And so Andrew and Victoria put these together. We kind of created a template, and then they populated it with all the data from the project. So this is actually an example here. This one is the gnarled Chapman. This was found by Eric Schatt, who's Redbird Orchard up in Trumansburg. And it's actually the product that's on the far right with the flip top on it. And this is an apple that he found locally, and it just had incredibly high tannins, just really like mouth puckeringly high tannins, something that he had really seen in a lot of the European varieties that he had grown. It was measured by, we use a method called the Follin-Shaktu method at 7 grams per liter. And we think of an apple being bitter when it goes above 1.2. So several fold higher magnitude as an example. This one is actually really cool. It's, just before I get into that, one of the things that we, Andrew and Victoria did is they put in tasting notes. So they also tasted all the apples as they came into my lab. And so this one here said, subtly sweet, very bitter, one of our favorite apples. And then we also, when we had the producer giving us quotes from the interviews, we'd add those in there too. And then we turned these into PDFs and we sent them back to the producers so they learned the information about their apples. We also included the genetic testing. And so we learned that the gnarled Chapman had Northern Spy as one of its parents. And then the other parent was unknown. So it's probably a seedling of seedlings out in there. And a lot of them were like that. So this one is quite interesting because it's gained some traction amongst the cider making community. And they started, Eric made it freely, the budwood freely available. And even nurseries are now starting to propagate trees and sell trees of the gnarled Chapman. So it's starting to enter into the commercial nursery trade. And that's just an example of it from Fedco Seeds up in Maine selling scion wood. This is the cider in the small bottle. And Maria mentioned this one earlier. This is from Penning's cidery down in the Hudson Valley. It's called the Continental. And there's actually a single tree. So that cider is not like a single estate. It's actually a single tree cider. All the apples come from just one apple tree. And the folklore around this apple tree and the family history is that the Continental Army camped underneath this tree. So we called it the Continental. We measured it, did a lot of tests on it. It is related to this very obscure southern variety. How it got to the Hudson Valley, we don't know, but it's quite interesting. You can taste that one in the back. And then a third example of these report cards is called this one. What's this one called, Maria? This is the,
I think that's
the name got cut off, I think.
not, I think is that one.
Okay. And so this is by Melissa Madden. And you can see this one is like a crab apple. It's a very small apple there on the chart, on the picture there. And it probably has a parent of Malus floribunda. So not even a domesticated apple is one of the parents, but a crab apple as one of the parents. When we look at the fruit quality attributes overall amongst the entire population, and we had only about, just shy of 50 samples. So, this is not a huge sample size, but just to give you some ideas of what we found. Fruit size tended to be a lot smaller than what we see for commercial apples. A lot of the other attributes really range considerably. You can see the min, the max, and the mean there for various chemical attributes as we go across. I want to highlight the Folin-Chakatu method there kind of in the middle. That's our measure of phenolics or tannins. And I mentioned like 1.2 being the threshold at which an apple becomes bitter. So these are apples that you guys don't want to eat. Like these are be very unpleasant to eat fresh. But the cider makers like it because it gives the cider a lot more mouthfeel, a lot more interesting characteristics. And you'll notice that from the ciders in the back. They also had a lot of sorbitol. A lot of these apples were really high in sorbitol. It's a sugar alcohol, and it lends itself to some residual sweetness on the back end of the product. And I think that was something that the cider producers were looking for. If we map some of that data to this really common categorization that is used for cider apples of being either sweet, meaning high sugar, low acid, sharp, meaning more acid, sharp or sour, bittersweet, meaning it has not much acid, but a lot of tannins, a lot of phenolics, and bitter sharp, meaning it has everything, right? It has a lot of tannins, has a lot of acid. We can see that the population really skewed overall towards the bitter sharp. 45% of the samples that we got were bitter sharp. A lot fewer were in the sharp or sweet categories. And those are kind of apples that you would find more in the commercial trade, right? Those would be things that you'd be more familiar with. Bold and Delicious and Gala and things like that would either be sharp or sweet apples. So Cameron Peace, who's with WSU, Washington State University, has developed a SNP-based platform for doing genetic testing, genetic fingerprinting, and then also pedigree analysis for apples. And his reference panel now includes thousands of different apples, most of the well-known apples and many of the apple varieties that are in the USDA's germplasm collection are in there as well. So we sent leaf samples to that lab, and then he sent us the data back telling us, is this a known variety or is this related to known varieties? So out of the 38 samples that we submitted, just shy of 80% of them were unique, right? So no hit in the reference panel. So these are true seedlings. Some of the common parents, not surprisingly, are apple varieties that have been grown in New York State for quite a long time. So things like Northern Spy, Wolf River, Ben Davis, some of these are quite old. You actually wouldn't really know about them unless you're an apple geek or kind of like study. A lot of these apples went out of favor about a century ago, right? But they're still out there and the pollen is out there, or maybe there's a tree and pollen from another source is coming in. We don't know which way that goes. But that was pretty cool. I had suspected when we started this project, and I mentioned that in the video, that most of the apples that they were foraging from were going to come back as something that is known. Like they're just like, this is great. Well, of course it's great. Like people have known that's great for years and they actually have a name for it. And in fact, many of them were truly seedlings, which was fun. Okay. The last part of the project I want to mention is really about the engagement we had. And we have Andrew and Victoria here, and we'll have them come up and be able to answer some questions about their experience with it. But we also took them out to some field trips. So this is a picture of us going with Steve Seelan from South Hill Cider. He goes up to the National Forest, the Finger Lakes National Forest. He's got a map, GPS, everything located of all these wild trees that are up there that he likes to collect from. So we went out with him one day and tried to find some of this fruit. And we ended up spending a few hours crawling around on our hands and knees, picking up pears from somebody's backyard in the end. You know, we kind of rambled through the entire Finger Lakes and looked at a whole bunch of things. Not ready yet, not ready. This one doesn't have enough fruit. And we ended up in this person's backyard. Oh yeah, I have this agreement. We can go in there. All right, like really nice house. And well, that was quite an experience, and also made me really appreciate some of my work into mechanical harvesting. I'm getting a little old for crawling around my hands and knees. So kudos to Mike Brown here. We're shown on the left, and on the right, our lab manager. And then Victoria and Andrew actually did almost all of the actual fruit evaluation. Oh, here we are with the pear trees. So that's one pear tree. He makes a perry, which is the cousin of cider made from pear juice, from almost entirely from that one variety, one tree. And here we are in the National Forest, just kind of looking around. That's on the far right there, that's Leaf, who works with Steve, staring into the tree. I love that picture of him. And then just a final comment. I mean, one of the things that we really have worked on is transdisciplinary. I'd say it's really, a step above just interdisciplinary, where we really tried to merge our disciplines together to try to understand this problem. And that was a lot of fun. Not often those of us on the STEM side of things, on the natural science side of things, work with our colleagues on the other side of campus and try to approach things from the social side or the ethnographic side. And our undergrad researchers got that experience as well. They did a lot of transcription. They went through hours and hours and hours of the interviews, and then had to listen, make sure that they use AI for the actual transcription, but they have to go through and fact check it. But then more importantly, the work that they had to do was to kind of listen carefully and pull out those important quotes, right? And pull out the important information that then Maria used for understanding those selection principles that she described before. Okay, so just lastly, some of the pictures of some of the foraged fruit. This is not pretty stuff, right? You wouldn't buy this at the supermarket. It doesn't taste good. It doesn't look pretty, but yet important for the cider makers. And I want to say one of the things that we found through this project as well was that foraging for apples was really important for a lot of the startups, right? They don't have a lot of capital. A lot of them are doing it kind of as a side project, and they need the raw ingredient. They need apples somehow. And foraging, getting them for free, was just a low entry point into a low cost entry point into the cider industry. And even Steve Seelan, who's South Hill Cider, and it's a big operation now, he said that he wouldn't have actually gotten to this point if he didn't start out using foraged fruit. He couldn't afford, when he started, to buy the amount of fruit that he needed. Okay, so why don't we invite everybody up, Victoria and Andrew and Maria. And that's all we have for a presentation. And we just wanted to give you some snippets of everything we studied, but then leave enough time that we could answer some of your questions about the project and what you guys want to hear more about. Jenna has a question.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. I guess this is kind of a big question, but something I was thinking about the whole time was for people who aren't just finding these trees on like their property and whatnot, like, is this legal? Right, and yeah, I mean,
sometimes.
Yeah. there are agreements and there's also casual like mushroom foraging, you know your spots, you're an individual. It's another thing when you're then selling and marketing it. And I guess there are kind of like gray areas and whatnot in your interview processes. Did you hear about like something that stands out to me is that if you're in that sort of gray line, or you might be showing out near someone's backyard or something like that, right? Like white cider makers are probably going to feel safer doing that. Like I know as a woman, like men probably feel safer wandering out to the woods and hauling.
The color of your skin and your gender plays into this in a big way.
Yeah.
We did a panel for CiderCon, and this was a really big topic. CiderCon's like the industry CiderCon, right? That's cute. And that was a big topic of conversation. Maria, do you want to?
Yeah, so I could write a whole book just about that, right? And some of these social issues are really, really fascinating. So one of the interesting distinctions is like, are you on private property or public property? And one of the hot spots for this practice here in the Finger Lakes is the Finger Lakes National Forest, right? Public land. Now, is it legal on public land? Technically, you're supposed to get a permit, which is like $35 and like one page you have to fill out. And one of the people who we worked with has never, I would say nobody ever does that. And one day, like one of the park rangers came up to one of our informants and was like, you know, you need a permit to do that. And he was like, oh, okay. And so he paid it sort of like post facto. So I think on the public property side, part of the benefit is that like this is public property and there are some regulations. They're very poorly enforced. They don't have the personnel to go around and like, you know. If you're on public property, then one of the things you have to think about is that everybody else has equal access, right? So stoking out your tree, you know, and making sure you get to it before anyone else does, hiding your spots, like these are all practices within this realm of public property. And private property, it's really negotiating these relationships. So a lot of people told me how they negotiated relationships. People generally want to be respectful of private property, so they would go knock on the door and say, hey, I see you have some trees. Like, could I harvest them and then work out a deal? And that deal could be like, sure, take whatever you want, to like barter and trade, to monetary exchange. And then, you know, people just coming to them. There was one cider maker who had a whole spreadsheet of sites, you know, that people had brought to his attention. They're like, oh, I have this tree. I know this guy who has a tree. They have a whole spreadsheet. They had a whole like harvest, you know, logistics of going out to all these sites. So actually managing all of that is a big part of this process, and something that, you know, can be contentious, does have legal ramifications, although for the most part, I would say it's very informally dealt with. Did you guys see anything in the interviews that struck you on that topic?
I think what she said, like it's private and public land. And for the private land, yeah, you just reminded me of the interview. I forget the person that did it, but he said like he would just drive around, like, and then one day he found this like really cool looking apple tree in someone's backyard, and he's like, oh, like this could be a really good piece of fruit. Like maybe we should go talk to them. So over like that time, he worked up courage to go knock on their door and ask them, hey, like I know a lot about apples, like I can do some pruning for you or something. I really love to use your apples for the cider. And so over time, he built this relationship up, and over time, also he would make cider with that fruit and give it back to the landowner as a thank you. So it's pretty cool to see how these sort of agreements are established.
I will say that just to our CiderCon, you know, it was rather explosive conversation. These issues of race, gender, class, you know, politics also definitely loom large, and there has been considerable discussion about that amongst the people engaged in this practice.
The CiderCon comment comes from because one of our we had a couple producers on a panel. And one of them said, well, if I see a MAGA flag or a Trump flag, I don't go near the property. And then somebody in the audience said, why not? And so it kind of spiraled from there into this whole other conversation about politics. Yeah. Bill, you have a question?
Why is the national forest such a hot spot?
Oh, yeah.
Is it because it wasn't logged, or because it's such an enormous space, or what?
Yeah, the national forest is fascinating. There was a time when there were a lot of people who lived up there and they had small scale property, and they would do some, probably homesteading of some sort. At some point, the federal government wanted to move the population away from rural areas into more urban areas where they had access to utilities and other things, and they moved the people off of that land. I don't know all the details of how it, Maria probably knows more of the details, but basically what they left behind were their homesteads with apple trees on them.
Right.
And then also there's
it very well may have been seedling apples, right?
Well, and there could have been seedlings, and also there is quite a bit of
Grazing.
Grazing up there with cattle. Yeah. And the cattle, like when you feed cows apple pumice with lots of seeds, and you plant that seed in some manure, it's a great way to start a new apple tree.
I might be able to add a little bit to that, not particularly like the Finger Lakes National Forest, but my family has a cider operation here we're working on called Three Eagles Farmstead in Dryden, so like 15 minutes east of here. And we got really lucky with our land is we have around 200 barrel apple trees, all like genetically unique, like hard to find what the closest sort of lineage would be, all sort of condensed in this forest. And so what I've heard from some people around here is that like a long time ago, like settlers would come and have like dairy operations, a lot of them from English colonies that would bring apples, right? They've been making hard cider for a long time. And I guess like over time, as the cows moved out, the transition, it started to grow. So that's sort of what we have in our backyard. So.
Tom?
This is a comment. After the War of 1812, there was an incentive to distribute people into the West. This was westward expansion. And there were grids laid out. And if you are on the other side of Cayuga Lake, you see these remnants, if not existing roads that are on mile square properties, basically. And those have been subdivided multiple times, but basically a whole bunch of people moved here between 1812 and 1820, more or less. And that is kind of the origin of a lot of people planting apple trees.
And so what we're probably seeing is the second or third generation of apple trees after those people planted trees. Oksana, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, forgot it for a second. So foraging itself, like as a concept, doesn't really scale all that much. Like if everybody starts foraging, there's not really going to be much left to forage. And I'm curious if like the people that you were interviewing and talking to, maybe this is something for you two who are listening to all that hours of interview material, were people a little bit like hesitant to talk about their spots for fear of like, Maria was saying that they're a little bit iffy on giving away the actual spots, but there are people who like declined at all to interview. Like, was that ever an issue that came up?
Yeah, they definitely did talk about it a lot in the interviews. You guys would probably know more about what the producers would say specifically about like the identity of that one apple was not disclosed or locations and stuff. But I got the feeling that they were willing to share for the most part with like a research institution as long as it didn't like give away any big identifying information.
Yeah, I didn't see many barriers, I guess. I mean, sometimes it was like mushroom or foraging, right? Where it's very secretive. But I think another thing that's could extend to as well is a lot of people were interested in maybe, taking this apple that has desirable genetics for our local sort of area and being able to maybe work with institutions like Cornell to help commercialize that, making it more accessible. Because I think one of the big bottlenecks for the cider industry here is finding desirable apples that have those tannins, that have acid, right? It can be very difficult to source them. We have a lot of, dessert apples around here. So that's another sort of discussion too, is how a lot of interests, how can we commercialize these apples, get them more available to producers of cider around the Northeast.
I'll just add to say that there are hot spots where there is competition, and that the Finger Lakes National Forest is one of them. And the Finger Lakes National Forest is complicated by the fact that the deer pressure is not allowing new apple trees to grow, right? However, beyond these sort of hot spots that are especially public land, I mean, there is tons of things in people's backyards or the back 40. So I wouldn't say there's a lack of fruit. It just depends where you're looking for it.
There's a scalability question. There's also, and we'll have your question next. Just one more comment on that. There was, a lot of these people have a little bit of a counterculture edge to them, right? They're going a very non-traditional route of making a commercial product. And there was quite a few times in the interviews where people knew that Cornell, particularly, but also Rutgers, involved in this project and feeling like, oh, we don't want you guys to, come in and learn about our apple and then take it as your own and try to, patent it. And then we don't have access to it now, right? Because Cornell steals the genetics that we found in the wild. And there was a real fear for that. And I think that's based in reality, maybe not for like apple genetics in the US, but certainly like this is a story that has happened amongst different populations around the world, where mostly Northern Hemisphere people came in and took certain plants or certain varieties of plants and then made it, their own. And so, I think that kind of thought was definitely prevalent amongst the producers. We have time for one last question.
It's really quick. Kind of going off the box science question. In your interviews with some of these individuals, did you kind of perceive, or did they even note to this, that were they willing to gatekeep this practice? Like they don't want more people to do it, or do they want more people to be included? They just want to keep their specific locations, hotspots secretive?
I think I would answer it a little bit differently, in the sense that yes, people gatekeep their specific spots. In between that and the sort of institutional critique of working with, academic institutions or commercial institutions or industry, there's also this realm of citizen science, right? These people are networked to each other. They are sharing with each other. And there's a very strong ethic of equitable and ethical sharing within the citizen science community. So it's not that people, there is like, this is my tree. But then beyond that, I think people do really want to keep that network of knowledge flowing. There's just a reticence of like, we don't want outside people who have interests other than ours to come in and steal, right? But if you're working together, in a sense of sharing, I think that people are very open and not really gatekeeping. I would also say that there's thoughts about like, how can we bring more people from those, gender, race communities who feel less comfortable doing this? How can we make it more accessible for more kinds of people? That's definitely part of the conversation. So yeah, I think it's one of the things I will say is that Greg and I have known a lot of these people for a long time. So even though there was this reticence about working with institutions, they knew us and they, I think, trusted us, right? So I had known a lot of these people and had networked with the wider network quite a lot before we actually started doing the project as a project.
Great. So we're out of time. There's a couple comments in the chat here, and thanks, just kind of highlighting some of the different socioeconomic factors that played into people first being on some of these wild lands like the Finger Lakes National Forest, and also pointed out Mount Pleasant, Connecticut Hill is another location where there's a lot of old apple trees. So there's a lot of these kinds of sites around the local area and in the Hudson Valley as well. And so thanks for those comments online, and thanks to the project team. It's really been a lot of fun working with you guys over the last few years. So really appreciate it. If you guys want more cider, we're gonna hang out and drink some cider for a few minutes. So go have another glass. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.